So on behalf of my colleagues at the Healthy Materials Lab and the Architectural League of New York, I'm delighted to welcome you to another edition of this Field to Form series. This ongoing event series explores biogenic materials as a means to drive beauty and innovation in design, with the broader aim of decarbonizing and detoxifying design and building practices. I'd like to make a shout out to my colleagues Anne Reiselbeck and Paul Lewis for the lively partnership in curating these programs. We hope that will continue. And to Zoe Fruchter, Damasi Darby Washington from the League, and to Ahelia Prasad for dreaming up the food that I hope you're enjoying tonight.
And the drinks.
And the drinks. To Christina and G at our comms, to Allison and Catherine and Emma and anyone else you see with a yellow dot who helped make these events alive for you. My name is Jonsara Ruth. I'm the co-founder of Healthy Materials Lab and professor here at Parsons. So somebody asked me this tonight, how many previous events have you had from Field to Form? So we were counting, but I'll just name them. Stone, earth, hemp, straw, mycelium, cork, bamboo. That's a lot. And tonight, of course, corn, specifically corn stover, the often overlooked byproduct of corn that's inspiring new ideas in materials and for design. If you haven't seen it already, make sure that you see the display of healthier regenerative corn-based products curated by the Dongia Healthier Materials Library and led by August Rust. There's a great selection that came from all over the world, actually, right here, and some by our speakers from tonight. A few quick housekeeping notes. We have CEUs for tonight, not only HSW CEUs, but also landscape CEUs from Field to Form. And there's a QR code just as you leave, so don't forget to get your CEUs. Also, bathrooms are in the back of the space. A note of gratitude to the donors who make this program possible. Tonight's program is made possible by the members and supporters of the Architectural League of New York. Additional support is provided by the New York State Council for the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and New York State Legislature. Thank you, New York State. Of course, membership makes all of this possible, so if you're not already a member of the Architectural League or an ambassador of Healthy Materials Lab, we invite you to join both of those organizations. As many of you here in the audience know, Healthy Materials Lab was established to support and accelerate healthier, low-carbon building strategies, materials, and practices. We advocate for materials that originate from carbon-sequestering plants and minerals to reduce our reliance, dramatically reduce, and maybe eliminate our reliance on petroleum-based materials and fossil fuels. Corn, as many people know, is one of the most cultivated crops on Earth. So tonight we ask, is it underutilized as a source for building materials? Do we need to examine how we utilize it as a source for building materials? So tonight we're here to explore the potential of maize beyond food, although please imbibe. Its stalks, husks, cobs, silks, and leaves, and some of that stover example came from one of our speakers, Margaret Smith, on the table tonight, so you can see it in its green state. Its scientific name, Zea mays, is defined in indigenous cultures as bringer of life, or mother of all things. It's a plant that has been revered by humans for millennia. Our panelists tonight are grounded in knowledge about all aspects of corn, from its genetics to its cultural significance, from field to form, literally, and will help us expand our understanding of this plant. We're so appreciative of the time, the attention, the lengths of travel our panelists took to be here with us tonight. Their full biographies are online and extensive and impressive, so I'll just make a brief note to introduce each speaker. Margaret Smith is a leading maize breeder, a plant scientist, professor emerita at Cornell University. Her work in the lab and hands-on in the field focuses on breeding corn for productivity and resilience in New York State. She began her work improving crop varieties for small-scale subsistence farmers in Latin America, which is an ongoing interest. Lane Segerstrom is founder and CEO of CornBoard manufacturing and comes from 5 generations of Iowa farmers. He reimagines corn stover, or as he says, refuse that's valuable, a scalable resource for manufacturing and design, and creates new renewable composite materials from agricultural byproducts. Fernando Laposse is a Mexican designer whose practices explore the cultural, ecological, and economic potential of plant-based materials. Collaborating with indigenous communities, he reveals stories woven into plant fibers and addresses environmental crises, biodiversity loss, and migration through design. And to start us off tonight is my friend and colleague Mae-ling Lokko, an architectural scientist, designer, educator, and member of the Architectural League here in New York, and will provide an overview of corn and stover. Her notable work investigates how agricultural residues can become a foundation for low-carbon, regenerative building systems and practices. After the presentations, we'll engage in a discussion with each other, and we'll save time at the end for your questions. So please jot them down as you have them. And now I'll hand it over to Mae-ling. Thanks for being here.
Good evening, everyone. So nice to see you again. I think the last time we did this, I participated in the mycelium event. So it's nice to shift. I think I'm sick of fungi. But yes, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Field to Form Corn series. This is sort of a very deeply personal one for me because I've been working on a book on corn and sugar, the 2 most cultivated grasses on the planet. So according to my architect math, you can check this later, but for every human on this planet, there are roughly 180 sugarcane plants and almost 4 times more corn plants that are grown for our consumption. Just to say that these plants vastly outnumber us on this planet. This is sort of a dense chart giving an overview of the major agricultural crops according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, shown on the first row. And then on the bottom, you see the sort of building material applications that we've sort of seen from these agricultural residues. So corn, which is the second column, has been used for insulation, hardboard, particle board, as well as a range of plasterboards. The big 4, sugar, corn, rice, and wheat, constitute over half of everything we grow to feed ourselves. And sugarcane and corn are king and queen. And so the question I've been asking is, why these 2 plants? And how does their models of scaling impact our world? So to understand this with respect to corn, we kind of have to go back to its wild ancestor, the mighty and resilient teosinte. So it's a fantastic grass species. Many cultivated white plants have been well on their way to human domestication, only to slip back into the wild as our taste changes. Or maybe a newer, better plant candidate appeared. But not sugarcane and corn. We've admired them, we've fallen in love, we've become obsessed with them for both good and bad. And so like many great plants, we begin near a river. Teosinte originated in the Balsas Valley of southwest central Mexico over 9,000 years ago in sort of this really dry climate. And it had to compete, this grass had to compete with tropical deciduous trees as well as other grasses for soil nutrients. A teosinte air is only about 2 to 3 inches with, a few kernels, and sort of compare that with modern corn, sort of 12-inch ear that boasts over 500 kernels. Its kernels also have this really hard coating, and we've sort of selectively bred them to shift this sort of tooth-cracking coating, which is now sort of just that annoying bit that gets stuck in between your teeth when you eat corn cob, right? And so what makes the wild grass ancestors of modern corn formidable was really its roots. Growing up in this sort of nutrient-deficient environment, teosinte would decrease its above-ground biomass and allocate a lot of its resources to its rhizosphere. Within ancestral maize species, there's also a diversity of land races of maize, i.e. those sort of adaptations to different environmental conditions, as well as the care of Mesoamerican farmers who farmed and intercropped them carefully on milpa garden systems. So not only was the corn prized by different Mesoamerican cultures as sacred, as food, but also their byproducts, even the corn husk, was used to wrap traditional dishes like the ever-popular tamales. The husk sort of holds the masa in shape during steaming. It regulates the moisture, releasing all of these earthy, grassy notes into the masa. Its sort of layer paper structure kept the tamales warm after cooking and really protected it after travel, during travel. It's commonly known as our first sort of portable fast food, slow food really. It's nutrient dense, and it sort of enabled all of these different great civilizations from the Olmecs, the Mayans, the Aztecs, to travel long distances. Fernando's work tonight, celebrating the biodiversity of corn in Totomoxtli, am I saying that right? Fantastic, okay. Veneer material sort of celebrates a spectrum of color in the husks of heirloom Mexican corn, using biodiversity in design products to sort of support regenerative farming practices. Corn's travel from Mexico is one of the great stories of agricultural diffusion. It first went southward to Central and South America, northward to what is now the American Southwest. At the turn of the 15th century, Columbus brought it to Europe, where it moved with remarkable speed. Both Spain and Portugal integrated them into their trade networks, and so we can see the Portuguese introducing its way around the African continent, down to the south of Africa to the east, as well as to the other way to South and East Asia. Wherever it went, it made friends with soils and climates everywhere. It didn't ask for much. It gave you a lot in terms of calories, enabling it to fill food gaps in places where existing carbohydrates were not able to. And so if we look around different types of architectures where it went, we see the Tabique walls in Portugal, which used a corn cob. I don't know if you can see it over there, but it's literally in between these sort of wood panels in the infill. So in timber frame construction, it was sort of this thermal insulation material. We can also see when it was taken across the Atlantic, it was brought to the Azores, where it dethroned wheat as the major crop in the 16th century. But you can kind of see the full corn ear being used as the envelope of these corn storage houses, which were well ventilated in that humid climate, and sometimes even brought inside and composing the ceiling of buildings. That's insane, right? Oh my God. In the South and East United States, we've seen the architecture of corn crib, sort of typologies for storing corn, very much inspired by Native American storage architecture. From the late 19th century onwards, we saw the evolution of crossbreeding for more desirable and resilient traits. Professor Margaret Smith is going to do justice to this enduring legacy of corn breeding today in upstate New York and beyond. And so hybrid corn gave popcorn, yes. Productivity led to excess, and it's embodied in sort of South Dakota's corn palaces, which again, insane, right? The first one was built in 1892. Its exterior facades were made with the grains of corn, grasses, and other native grains. And the agenda of the corn palaces were to attract settlers, railroad, or economic investors. The message was, look at how corn is growing here, come and farm. And it definitely did that. In times of war, we see the proliferation of corn to meet wartime demand. The government said, we will subsidize this. If you plant more corn, we will assure you of guaranteed minimum prices. And the short-term impact was incredible. Farmers borrowed heavily to buy more acreage to farm. More land was cultivated, even fringe land, and there was accelerated research into hybrid corn. All of this leading to giant surpluses. So what happens when you scale production of plants to meet a short-term need? What happens to that surplus? And so we see how corn was developed to displace other types of plant applications. It displaced its forebearer sugar in high fructose corn syrup. It was also used in fertilizers, ethanol. And its impacts on the American food table was incredible. There was an enormous new industrial demand for corn to absorb that chronic surplus. It devastated the sugar industry in the South as well as the Caribbean. the public health impacts we know of today, which has led to the obesity epidemic. And that arc in terms of corn farms have shifted dramatically from pre to post-war. The sizes of farms dramatically increased, became fewer in number, more specialized. Pre-war, corn farms were mixed biologically. They had different grains. They were mixed with livestock. Post-war corn farms were dependent on hybrid seeds, synthetic inputs, and they were incredibly productive. And we have Lane here, 5th generation corn farming history, to talk about this transformation as well, maybe in the Q&A. And so how do we capture and expand the value of different agricultural byproducts of this complex corn value chain that we have today by making the most of the stover itself? Today there are a few products, this is just a few, and we'll talk about quite a few others. But corn-fed mycelium and insulative boards, feeding the stover to mycelium, have sort of come and gone. This has now been replaced by hemp shives and wood chippings. We use this in my company Ambus to make these sort of biocomposite fiber boards where the interior are corn-fed mycelium and the exterior are other types of plants like coconut husk and soy. Wall particle board panels from the corn cobs by Front, formerly known as Stone Cycling, which is a sort of a Dutch company, and they're undergoing a revamping and launch of this CornBoard product. We will hear about this from Lane through the myriad of pressed CornBoard products that are replacing everything from OSB to other types of different densities of particle boards or reconstituted wood products. So corn building materials today form a very small fraction of the corn value chain. This is dominated by far by ethanol. This is Iowa's sort of value chain, corn value chain, which is Iowa is the leading producer of corn in the country. Ethanol dominates, we have feed, we have fructose and other food products. And so with such a crowded value chain, are corn building materials feasible? But more importantly, even if they aren't, sorry, Lane, corn and corn byproducts are really a model for sort of examining how scaling bio-based materials have gone. As proposed in our 2023 UNEP Building Materials and Climate Report, if low-carbon bio-based building materials will form about half of everything we build with by 2060, how will scaling agricultural residues for building products impact or be impacted by shifts in this sort of interconnected material value chain and warming planet? So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Professor Margaret Smith to kick things off.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Mae-ling. I think you kind of covered the plant breeding piece of it for me, but I'm the resident corn plant breeder for this, so I feel a little like a fish out of water, but I hope I'll have some things that will be interesting and challenging for you to think about. So I am a corn breeder. I work with field corn, both in Latin America and then mostly for the last number of years here in New York State. So I wanted to start by looking at the relative corn grain production across some of the 25 major corn producing states in the US. So if this little thing, this little pile here in New York represents 4.8 billion pounds of grain, and I point that out because the stover is what's left over after you harvest the grain, so that's the part that could be extra and used for construction. This is what the rest of the states look like, and I will just note that Iowa has like 30 times as much grain as New York State. So we're sitting in New York, and I figured, okay, if we want to think about building materials here in New York, the stover in New York is much more limited than the stover, as Lane will tell you, in Iowa. I will also note that in New York, half of our corn, that little green pile there, is to represent silage. So about half of our corn acreage in New York, so about 1 million acres we grow, about half of that acreage is harvested as silage, which means the entire plant is harvested and fed to livestock. So this is what that looks like in terms of the residue that is left in the field. So the field on the left here is a silage harvest field, and you can see that really the only thing left there is some stumps. So there's really not much left over there. Everything is being fed to the livestock. The field on the right has been harvested for grain, and you can see there's nice piles of stover sitting there waiting to be used. So that's the potential material, and for us in New York, it's that little pile, but it's 500,000 acres, so it's not insignificant. I guess we were channeling each other because I have exactly the same map yet again. But I wanted to look at the question of, okay, you got corn stover, but how is it distributed across the landscape? Because it's not free to harvest. If you look at Iowa, sorry, Lane, I'm not picking on Iowa. It's just they're the other end of the extreme here. The state has 36 million acres of land, and corn is planted on roughly a little more than a third of them. Here in New York, we have 35 million acres, almost the same size as Iowa, but corn is planted on 0.5 million of them. Like, it's 1/70th, I think, of the acres in New York. So the distribution of stover in different states is going to be really different. So whether you can economically collect that and use it in a building process will vary dramatically depending on where you are and what the distribution of corn production looks like. The other thing I want to note, and I already got an answer earlier from Lane about this, but so he'll probably correct me for worrying about it. But again, if you look at Iowa, this picture on the left is a picture of a harvested cornfield or a recently growing cornfield. I'm sorry, the slides are kind of dim. A recently planted cornfield in Iowa. So those of you who are from here in New York State, what do you not see in that field? Rocks. This is what a field in New York is more likely to look like. So there's a reason that all that corn is produced in the central part of the US. There's a reason that that part of the country is the best corn producing area in the entire world. It has these hugely deep mollisols, soils that have been created under prairie for years and years and years, and they basically don't have rocks. If you're going to harvest the stover, which is laying on the ground, here in New York, you got to deal with not harvesting all those rocks along with that stover. So how do you pick it up in a way that keeps it relatively clean and keeps the rocks out of all that machinery that you use to pick up that stover? So I'm throwing out some of the challenges here. Okay, so there were some of the economics, the challenge of how you actually get it out of the field, how widely dispersed is it across the landscape, and is it economical to collect it for a fabrication process? And those answers will vary dramatically depending on where you are. So now I'm going to pivot a little to corn breeding, which, you know, Mae-ling already covered. So I have my picture of teosinte and corn. You know, this is the breeding process that indigenous farmers carried out, starting from those indigestible seeds, which you had to crack open if you were to get any nutrition out of them at all, to an ear with hundreds of kernels on it. And then corn breeders and indigenous farmers across the world developed a huge array of different types. Now, plant breeding, I like to think of plant breeding as a design process. I realize I'm speaking to architects here, but our design units are the base pairs of the genetic material in corn. And our job is to try to assemble those into combinations which give you something that's more productive or more useful in whatever the situation you're trying to breed for. So farmers across the world have developed all those different types of corn. That immense amount of variation you see pictured on the right there is the result of individual base pair changes, mistakes in copying the genetic material of the corn, which happen all the time. The reason each of us in this room looks different is because we all had historically mistakes in copying our DNA that gave us different traits, okay? Completely natural process. So farmers across the world have developed a huge array of different types of corn. How might that be helpful in terms of using stover for a design process on the architectural side? So I wouldn't be a biological scientist if I didn't show at least one data slide, so prepare yourselves, here it is. So this chart on the left shows you some of the different fiber components that were listed in the slides we saw earlier from Mae-ling. So the blue bars on each set of three, the blue bars are the nutrient-detergent fiber, which is a bunch of the cellulose and hemicellulose and so on. The green bars are the acid detergent fiber, and the grayer ones on the right of each set of three are crude fiber, which is the completely indigestible part. And I chose this, and each set of three bars is a different variety. I chose this because I figure fiber is a critically important thing for building materials of one sort or another. And what the point is that different varieties do have different fiber compositions. This is something we could breed for, things which had more fiber or a different mix of types of fiber to make them better for building materials. So there's a way in which the design and the demand for the architectural products can drive the goals of the breeding process if there's enough demand to make that worthwhile. So that's a picture of variety effects. I also want to just note that there are management effects as well. So the picture on the right, again, it's the same, each set of bars is the same 3 different fiber components, but in this case, it's grown, the same varieties grown at 3 different levels of fertilization. So on the left is no nitrogen, in the middle is kind of typical corn belt nitrogen application, and on the right is high nitrogen. And you can see the variation isn't great, but it goes, the more nitrogen you give the plant, the lower the fiber content. It goes down, right? So that's just to be aware that how the crop is managed, in addition to the genetics, can make a difference to what you get out of that stover. Okay, I want to take a pause also to talk about, we've been looking at that stover as this available raw material, but it actually has functions as well in agricultural systems. So this just shows a picture of what some of the advantages of having crop residue on the soil surface are. And there's an array of them there. It helps reduce erosion. It can incorporate more organic matter into the soil, which helps crop production. You get better soil aggregation. You have less, I already said less erosion. Sorry, I can barely read my own slide. A number of these benefits that have to do with carbon sequestration, carbon capture, nutrients for the subsequent crop, and maintaining soil structure. So as we think about how to use materials in a way that's sustainable, we need to recognize that there are also probably going to be trade-offs from removing that stover from the field. That's not to say it's not a good idea. It's all about figuring out where the balances lie, because you're never going to have no impact. So those are some of the things that stover on the surface of the soil can do for you. Helps water infiltration, keeps soil moisture higher. I wanted to do a quick tour. You already had a bit of a tour of some of the ways corn is used in architecture, so I had a few of my own pictures that I wanted to share as well. So in Ethiopia, corn has been used as a building material for storage structures. You can see here the ears are stored on top of a bed of corn stover there that keeps them off the ground. Here's another example from Togo where the ears form the sides of the storage structure. And then people even use them for play huts for their kids in various places. And of course, I had to put the corn palace. We didn't plan these slides jointly, so when I first saw the slides, I was, darn, she got the corn palace in. So corn has been used in many ways. I hope I've given you some food for thought, and as a plant breeder, I want to close with a quote that is near and dear to many plant breeders. It comes from Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift. If you haven't ever heard this one, I love it. And he gave it for his opinion that whoever could make 2 ears of corn to grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before, this is what plant breeders do, would deserve better of mankind and do more essential service to his country than the whole race of politicians put together.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a great quote, wasn't it? I got my own up there, but it's not as good as that one. So I'd like to thank you for this invitation. I'm honored to be here and share our story. I was going to tell you a story about my first job, but it was really corny. Gotta throw a corny joke in. I know that picture's of me, and I chose that picture because I think it represents every child with a dream of what they want to be. As we chase those dreams, I think it leads us to a question we all share. Can we make a difference? And I've got good news. We can make a difference. Now, I can't prove that I started the untucked shirt trend, but it's in the 60s, so maybe it was. So another fashion trend, as you can see, I'm on the Dad's truck there. I got my red socks, probably to keep you from looking at my haircut. But that's my parents and my older sister, and then there's another picture of my two sisters. I have a brother as well, and my mother. That's recent. We've been involved in farming for a long time, so we've seen a lot of progression in good and bad, the challenges that we're all faced now with agriculture. So we're all kind of looking at those in a shared way. So I grew up on a farm and started inventing almost 3 decades ago. My first invention was called the CD poster. I came to New York for the first time. I was on the Montel Williams and won Best Invention, and that was pretty exciting. And then I ended up on Home Shopping Network, and later went on to, and then they started downloading music, and we know where that went. So I kind of hit the perfect bell curve on that one with all the Tower Records and all them. I made it in all those stores, and then they all went away. So you younger ones probably don't know what that was, but I guess the CDs are still around. And then I came across CornBoard. It wasn't called CornBoard, but the original patent came out of the University of Illinois, and it brought me back to my roots, and I thought, wow, what a way to develop something that I thought could make a difference. So that's a little bit of my background that led me to how we take stover from the field to a board. So this will be a quick little, get you all up to speed on what we're doing, and it'll tie into some of the stuff that Margaret talked about. But the steps to do this, and we spent a lot of time really going, how do we not disrupt the agricultural and capture some of this stover? So the first picture is of the stalk chopper that's actually raised up. And we asked the farmer to do this. And this is the only thing we asked the farmer to do. The reason they raise that up is so it drops out in a windrow and we can bale that up. So then they go back to normally farming and capturing the stover in the second picture, or not capturing the stover, but catching the corn, which is the main product, goes in from ethanol to all these other products. And then they drop that stover right there in the ground. And then we take a traditional tractor and baler, stuff that already exists, and we make these round bales. They're about 1,000 pounds each. So that picture, the larger picture, is only baling behind the combine. And we pull about 20% that's in the field. So you saw that slide earlier of Margaret's about the benefits. We're not disturbing some of those benefits, but we're still pulling some of that stover out. And so we just bale up a little bit. There's still lots of stover left in the field. Use a tractor with a loader. We load those up on a trailer with a traditional pickup truck, and then we take them to a facility or we store them, typically less than 10 miles away, so we don't have to drive them real far, use a lot of fuel. And all this equipment exists, so it can be scaled. A little fun fact that if you took all the stover in the US, which is 40% of the corn production in the world, and that stover, a ratio is for every bushel of corn you raise, which is 56 bushels of corn, you get 56 pounds of stover for every bushel you get and that's per acre. So if you get 100 bushels, you get roughly 5,000 pounds of stover per acre. So a lot of the stuff in Iowa, they're in the high 200s, so they're almost 300. So you almost have 15,000 pounds of stover in each acre that you can take some of that. So you can still get maybe 1,000 to 2,000 pounds per acre off the field without doing a lot of that. But if you build up all that stover that's in the US and put those 1,000-pound round bales that you see end to end, it go around the earth 21 times. It is the largest biomass on planet Earth readily available as a byproduct. So it's not complicated to get it out. I just showed you how you can do that, so you can all come out to the farm and we'll put you in a tractor and we'll let you go. If you can't drive a tractor, we'll put you in a pickup. So when we take that, we're getting the cob stalk, husk, and leaves. The cob and stalk, as you see in this next picture, is out of a single bale. It's over half of the quantity by weight. We do not press that into a board. We take that, which is quite a bit, and we turn it into biochar. That biochar can go back on the farmer's field. It's sequestered CO2. It can help with the microbial health of the soil by retaining nutrients, and it helps that, which is what we're learning in the last 10 or 15 years more than ever, that soil health is so important. And no-till, all these practices that was given off CO2 when you till, we can go no-till, and then we can do maybe a cover crop, and then plant without tilling the soil. It's a real good benefit. So removing some of that stover actually really helps. The farmer, come spring, there's not as much canopy, the soil's a little warmer, and if they do have some sort of, say, mold or fungi or something, us removing 20% is reducing that. If we do that year after year, we could actually, without chemicals or pesticides or herbicides, assist the farmer in managing what's going on in the stover that could be carried over from year to year. So removing some of that, putting the biochar back on, which adds value. So we're trying to look at every aspect as we go through this. So what we are left with is the husk and leaves. And we had to figure out how to separate it. That was quite a project. I won't go into that, but we separate the husk and leaves from the cob and stalk. And then we take that and press that under pressure with heat, and we pull vacuum. We add a binder, it's about 8%. We engineer the board based on the application, so we could have, say, a half-inch, quarter-inch, different thicknesses, different density, based on the application. The binder is the same thing, so we have different types of binders we use. We're trying to get as far away from some of the more dangerous ones. We stay away from formaldehyde. We're working with some soy binders, and we have some of our own I can't talk too much about that we're developing. So that's your quick lesson on how you get to CornBoard. Now, the bigger question is, how do we get it to market? So what we do is we go make a statement. So we get smart, and we do what Kevlar did with the bulletproof vest. So I went out in the garage and made a skateboard, and we went out and tried to break a Guinness World Record, of which we did. And that skateboard is now in the Smithsonian. And so it's kind of like the Kevlar bulletproof vest. If you can make a strong, then you can make other things like rope. And so it's a really, what we consider a big statement. We set the record and didn't get hurt, so we could keep going. So we created the brand Stalk It, which is surf, skate, and snow. So we started putting CornBoard in the cores of skis and snowboards. And the process of this is our products out there. You're building your brand. We're testing it. It's like going auto racing. That's what the auto industry did. That's how they break things and learn how to make a better car. This is how we make a better board. And again, we're trying to figure out how do we make a really good CornBoard, ultimately to get to things like pallets, building materials. So we're kind of doing our lab thing, but putting our product out there. Then we built a facility, and then we started making all kinds of things. That's the bigger picture is a cubby that we did for Sprint for their Overland Park headquarters. It's a little cubby we made for them. And then we have some cabinets. We have a soundboard. There's another one over here that I brought. It was a project we did where I told our guys at the R&D facility, I said, save all the coffee grounds. And so we saved them for a while. Then we made this slurry and dyed all the stover. And that's what we came up with, a soundboard made of dyed fibers. So there's lots of applications. And through this process, we're making better CornBoard. We're filing our patents. We're doing testing, knowing that we're going to go into industries and verticals like pallets. So we sent our pallet that we made to Virginia Tech. You need to have about 2,800 pounds to be in the market. And we tested it. I think they hold it for 24 hours, less than a 2 millimeter deflection. And then you kind of get a certification if you can do that, because nobody wants to put their stuff on a pallet that falls apart. Well, that first pallet that we sent out there went to, then after it meets that, then they push it till it fails. It went to 11,941 pounds before it failed. Then you get half of that rating. So we knew we had something there. And if we could make a pallet like that, we obviously could make building materials and all kinds of furniture and cabinets. Part of that process is we figured out how to naturally have a fire retardant, and we got a Class A fire rating, which is a game changer in housing and all kinds of other things. And it's a pretty cool category. I think bricks and cement are in that category. And then we also have a USDA certified bio-based products through the USDA, and that's on the pallet. One of the reasons we chose pallets versus going straight into building materials is there's a progression. Building materials is very finicky. If you put it in a home and it fails, it's called a lawsuit. If you put it in a pallet and it fails, you just take it out of service and put another one in. So, and one of the kind of unknown facts is 1 million acres of forests are cut down every year just to make pallets in the US. And almost half of our hardwoods are used in pallets. Almost unimaginable that that much goes into it. But there's over 2 billion pallets just in the US. Everything moves on a pallet. So we feel that that's a critical, sustainable thing that we can go into and put a leased pallet into the marketplace that outperforms current pallets, and we can offset some of the deforestation related to that. So that's a current facility there we have. This is the one where we're going to be building in Iowa that scales production, and that a plant will put out about 10 million square feet of board. So we think by our impact can not only help farmers with additional revenue stream, rural jobs, carbon capture, soil health, help with the forest, and ultimately housing.
Hello, everyone. My name is Fernando Laposse. I'm a designer from Mexico, and I work with corn, so that's why I'm here. I would say that I not only consider myself a designer, but also perhaps an artisan and possibly an activist as well. I sort of like to develop new materials that are linked to agriculture. And the way I work is always by first trying things out myself, dominating how to make a new material and how to craft it, and then show it to other people. And yes, so the material that I'm talking about today is this sort of veneering material that I've created with the husks, with the outer leaves that protect the grains. And what's special about these husks is that they are sort of heirloom varieties, native Mexican corns from very sort of ancestral provenance, and you know, I use those leaves to create the veneer, and I do this in collaboration with an indigenous community in the southwest of Mexico, in the region of Puebla, on the border with Oaxaca, and this town is very, very special. It's called Tonahuixtla, and I think what's really particular about it is that it's still an indigenous community that has managed to sort of maintain their language, their way of life, well into the 21st century. And what's really special about working here is that this is a place that is situated only 80 kilometers from the oldest site of, you know, the beginnings of corn domestication that has been spoken today. So, so you're really talking about working in the epicenter of corn, where it all started. And, you know, perhaps radically differently to Iowa, it's a place with super steep inclines, loads of rocks, and probably the shallowest soil. It's only about this deep, you know, but that's where it started. And so it really speaks about this kind of ancestral ingenuity of local farmers to understand plants and create, you know, an oasis of food out of a desert. I'll skip this one because I think we've seen a lot of that. But yeah, it's basically, you know, this is me the first time that I went to Tonahuixtla as a 6-year-old. And this was through an invitation by this man, Delfino, who used to work for my father. And I think what was really sort of eye-opening for me as a child was to not only to see that Mexico has this wonderful side of having a huge diversity in people, you know, going to a town that is only a few hours away from Mexico City, but the first language is not Spanish. It's quite impressive. But also, these people have different fruits and vegetables. You know, I've never seen corn this color in Mexico City, and all of a sudden it was like a rainbow in front of me. The other thing that I learned in those first visits was the milpa system. So this is what we call in Mexico the Three Sisters, which is the way that ancient Mesoamericans found how to grow corn, because what we've seen today is that corn is ultimately sort of a man-made plant. It's not natural. You don't have wild corn the way we know it today. So corn has an abnormal consumption of nitrogen from the soil. Like if you only plant corn, you have to complement it with something, otherwise it just completely depletes the soil. And this is something that people realized thousands of years ago. So you need to mix it with other plants to create that balance. And then the Three Sisters is corn, beans, and squash together. And particularly the beans, they have these little nodules in the roots that take nitrogen from the air and fix it in the soil. So that's an incredible system, but it's completely, you can't go over it with a tractor. It has to be hand planted and hand cultivated. And the sort of discovery of this system is what allowed us, as it was said previously, to really have the great civilizations of Mesoamerica, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Olmecs, the Toltecs, but also the huge diversity of cuisine that we have in Mexico as well, which is something that I'm going to really hit on with my presentation. It's also, something that has made corn a sacred plant in Mexico, still revered by indigenous communities till today. And so this sits in total contrast with what I feel is what has happened to corn today, which is that the majority of corn is not planted for direct human consumption. We talk about ethanol, starches, sugar additives, and so how does this sit in contrast with a society that considers a sacred plant and essential for their food? And I think this big sort of clashing of two worlds came really as a result of this sort of free trade agreement that Canada, the States, and Mexico signed in 1994, which really flipped agriculture on its head. From one year to the next, because of this hyper sort of subsidies that the States gives to corn, and all of a sudden our markets combining, the price of corn fell to a fifth of what it was worth before. So if you're a farmer and your subsistence was exclusively on corn, from one year to the next you had to produce 5 times more. And the only way of doing that was with chemicals and by abandoning the milpa system. And what this made was a total sort of breaking down of this millenary system, which in the case of Tonahuixla resulted in really severe erosion. Because remember, these are super steep lands, so if you take all these plants away and not replant them with anything, you basically get this. The switch to this foreign system had devastating consequences in the village. The weed killers were the worst, as they eradicated most of the wild shrubs. This caused a vicious cycle of erosion, which turned once fertile fields into desolate deserts. The topsoil has been washed away, leaving only rocks behind. So I think, something that has been really sort of, for me, important to say is that this in turn caused one of the main reasons for migration from this area, especially to the United States. So I think the project is also about talking about the complexities of migration, because, this is not a region that is affected by drug violence or anything like that. It was just, sort of kind of really ripping a system that was working and sort of following this false idea of progress of what the future should look like in this area. So what I did was, when I started to work with them, was to see how can we, really make something out of heirloom corns. And I think the most evident thing for me was to go and use the husks, because this is what makes them visually very, very different from the get-go. So what I did is, it's a very simple process. It's super DIY, very, very low tech, but it's basically just ironing and reinforcing the leaves. But it requires a lot of labor, With this, you can then make marquetry to make pieces of furniture like this. Remember, this is not dyed or painted in any way. This is straight from the plant. So, I'm going to scroll through a few pieces. This is all furniture, I've also developed things for wall application, you know, and I've done fancy things like this interiors for Hermes and, you know, all sorts of collectible design pieces. But at the heart of it really was, besides making the material, it was to create a working system. So one of the main challenges was to bring these varieties back that were gone. Even the seeds were gone after, you know, a decade and a half of this. So I started to work with the CIMMYT, which is the world's largest sort of collection of corn seeds. And they helped me reintroduce varieties that were from the region, taking them out of their vault. And, you know, and I think something that's really important for seed keeping is that the seeds, you know, keeping them in a seed bank should be the last resort. Really, the ideal thing for preservation is active planting. So how does the project work? It's creating this new source of revenue with the husks, incentivizing farmers to reintroduce the corn, and also working a lot with women, because women is the new demographic after all the men migrated, but also it's the best way to take these messages to the next generation, because they are the educators of the new generation. So I think after a decade, we can probably say that, you know, 8 species are back. We have this relationship with the CIMMYT. We create all this employment for 25 families. And I think the most successful thing is the return to the milpa system. I think another thing that is really interesting is to see how design can create value, because you know, typically the parcels are 1 hectare, which is about 2.5 acres. And they get, I mean, maybe a ton out of that in grain, which is, you know, by Iowa standards, super, super unproductive. But by making 1 square meter of this material, they can cover a whole season, you know, in terms of money. And I think something that's been really interesting is to see how this has inspired a lot of the farmers to use their knowledge to create new varieties. So, for example, this is one of our more successful farmers, which managed to cross-pollinate 2 varieties to create a new color of husk. So, for example, if you saw the images of a lot of the furniture, it was all like kind of purples and browns and stuff like that. And he managed to crossbreed 2 to make this sort of really nice peach purple color. So these were some of the, you know, the images that were before. And this is a new kind of color palette from a few years ago. And with that, we've been creating, you know, all sorts of new furniture, which has been selling super well. So I see this as the first sort of real 50-50 collaboration where I can bring, you know, the design innovation, but in terms of, you know, I mean, bioengineering a new corn, this is something that I have, you know, no knowledge of that, and they do very successfully. I think at the end, the goal is to create a new craft and a new generation of craftspeople. It's not to really just parachute myself into an existing crafting community and give them drawings, you know, so it's creating a system from scratch. I think, you know, design thinking is something that we always sort of get pounded on in design school, but it's always very much like urban design thinking. So I would say, you know, it's fun to think about rural design thinking, and the best way to do it is to be there. So to be part of the planting process, the harvesting process. I think the project has been also about encouraging families to be involved in every step of the production chain, from planting to the final product. And this is also a way to provide a new opportunity for returning migrants, because this is also a project to deal with migrants, but migrant projects are always about arriving migrants, but what happens with returning migrants? It's a whole different set of challenges, and that's what we're trying to do together. So I would say, you know, why does Tonawixla matter? Why should you be concerned about this here in New York? And this is a graph that I found in a magazine some years ago, which shows just the immense depletion of variety that we've had over the last century, you know, from having hundreds, literally hundreds of choices to only a few. If you go to a supermarket, you might think of it as an abundance in food, but what you're looking at is a total desert of biodiversity. So I think I would, you know, really stress the point that, in my opinion, you know, the environmental crisis is a man-made crisis. I don't think we should forget about human-centered design, but I think we should just diversify what kind of humans we are designing for. I think also something that for me is really, really important is to not forget that agriculture is culture. It's in the word, you know. So for me, it's really important to sometimes put away this idea of like having metrics for everything and just think about what we have to lose if we lose these farming traditions. It's ultimately losing culture. So I would say, you know, I could finalize this talk by talking about this phrase, which is amazing in Mexico. Sin maíz no hay país, which means without corn, there is no country. Thank you very much.
Wow. So inspiring, right? Just so inspiring. Mae-ling, I know we have a set of questions here, but I wonder if we just start by seeing if any of our panelists might have a question for each other before we start. So I was kind of waking you.
One. I think this is probably for Fernando, a question to you, because I think what I'm seeing, well, actually Margaret as well, is we all kind of have a different direction, but we're so tight and close together, not only because of corn, but our environment. And I'm just fascinated what you've done. I mean, both of you are pioneering things that are so critical for agriculture future, especially corn. Maybe you can make some comments that, I mean, you've completely changed what's going down in that area where you're listening. So I find that really true.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's, I guess, part of the sort of teachings that I've learned is that it's also it's a matter perhaps of scale. You know, we're all different. We're all working in very different scales, and for me, one of the biggest challenges was to not be over ambitious with scale, and almost to scale down and to say, okay, I'm not going to change the world trade of corn, but we can change what happens in this one town, and I think this one town becomes almost like a case study that, you know, parts of it can be used to then change certain mindsets or certain expectations about what progress looks like, you know.
We'll try this one. I don't know that I have a direct comment, but I think one of the things that's fascinating about listening to all these pieces of the story is that there's so many different levels at which you can think about the question of corn in design and in materials. And the solutions are going to be real different depending on the context. The culture is tremendously important. When we look at the US, the situation with how corn is grown and how extensively it's grown in some places is also highly influenced by policy. And that could change. You know, that could change. The one other thing I want to throw in, because it's been churning around in the back of my mind, and it's not at all a response to your question, but you know, we've been talking about, I think it was maybe Jonsara's introduction about reducing fossil fuel usage, but corn in the US is a fossil fuel intensive crop. So there's just another twist on, you know, these many interacting pieces.
Yeah, thank you all so much for those fantastic presentations. You've given us so much to think about. But we kind of wanted to start way at the beginning. You know, all of you spent a considerable amount of time on corn farms. Some of you've grown up on corn farms. And so before we get into, like, you know, the entire stakeholder framework and value chain, we're hoping you can bring us a little bit into your world. So what else is grown with corn? Who are the people involved in, you know, sort of corn industries as you've known? And how has that shifted? I think we got a glimpse of it, you know, in some of your presentations, but bring us into your world of corn. Maybe Lane, starting with you.
Well, growing up, it's changed in my lifetime more than you can imagine in terms of a farmer, of what they grow. And we're at a big crossroads in agriculture. And we all kind of, there's a big crisis going on and we're all staring at it. And some people are putting their heads in the sand. And we've got to start to address these. So agriculture is at a point, especially corn, the inputs, what's driving it, big ag, how do we keep a small farmer in business, and we know the importance of that impact. And when we look at making CornBoard, we're drilling down. It's like for every problem, there's 10 problems that exist, and if we do it this way, we don't solve these other problems, and most of them are related to environment or who gets that money. Does the farmer get that money, or does the big corporation get that money? Is that big corporation in another country? I mean, we're seeing this across multiple different scenarios. So for us, we're trying to go, okay, how do we help the farmer with the paycheck they haven't had? Now their kid goes to college, or they pay their bills. How do we go out in the field and not move it so far? So we use less diesel. Can we use biodiesel? Can we use more solar so we're not plugging into the grid? I mean, it's really deep, and that's been our biggest challenge as we scale, that we just don't scale creating more problems. And go, okay, we got bored now, we don't cut down a tree, but we just went and wreaked havoc on agriculture. So that's kind of the biggest challenge. And with our farms in Iowa, we have massive problems with our farms. I mean, groundwater problems, overspraying, you do something organic, the next thing you know, I mean, it's always windy in Iowa, somebody's spraying, it's going somewhere. So, I mean, those are the day-to-day challenges we have. And the farmer's caught in the middle, they can't control anything almost. They're controlled by insurance, by big ag, by government in a way. I mean, there's good things the government does, and there's also things that inhabits them. So they're very much in a big area that, to kind of cap that off, the closer we can get to a consumer and a farmer interacting, the better it is for everybody. That's kind of my opinion.
So I grew up in Western New York, so about 7 hours northwest of here. It's that other huge part of New York that is not the city. I always have a vision of the cover of the New Yorker that shows the New Yorker's perspective on the state. There is a lot more to the state. And one of the things I really appreciate about, I do not come from a farming family. My parents were both mechanical engineers. They're still confused. My grandfather was an architect, so I'm channeling him right now. But I grew up in a very rural town, so my school was across the street from a cornfield. Most of the people in my school were farmers. And that agriculture has changed in response to many of the same pressures that you were just talking about, Lane. So it's the internationally controlled price structure, which affects farmers here, as well it has dramatically affected the rural farmers in Mexico, right? And currently, fertilizer costs and energy costs, I mean, a lot of farmers I know in New York, and I'm sure elsewhere, have no idea how they're going to survive at this point, the coming growing season. So it's a challenging moment. I would say that one of the things that I really like about New York agriculture is that it's still got a lot more diversity to it. Iowa, if you look at the aerial photos, it's like half corn and half soybeans. That's the agricultural system. And that, when I showed that slide about area, a third of the land planted to corn, there's probably a third planted to soybeans, and the rest is roads and cities and houses. That's about it. So we have the advantage, if you will, of having a much more diverse agricultural system, which addresses some of the environmental challenges and some of the other things, but not all of them by any means. So I guess that's some of the ways that I see corn having changed over the years here in New York.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, in my case, I think for me the most tragic thing, which is a story that repeats itself across borders, is the loss of farmers. I mean, the amount of people that have become urban dwellers, So I would say, I would say it's more the question will be perhaps more, you know, because you say the closer that a farmer will be to the end consumer. But I would say even better is if someone from the city decides to go back to the countryside, because I think that's the disconnection between those two worlds, I think is part of the main problem. And invariably has to do, yeah, as you say, with economics. Something that's really interesting is that in this town, there was still a barter system up to the early 90s. And their coin was corn. So they could take a bag of corn and go and exchange it for a pair of shoes, you know. So the big crisis started because of that, because their bag of corn all of a sudden was worth nothing to exchange for. In the second half of the 90s, we lost close to 5 million farmers, you know. Most of them became farmers here or did other things here. And so that loss of knowledge, and as Margaret explained, you know, that loss of capabilities to make your local decisions of what is the best seed, what is the best food to grow, that a developing lab, you know, for technological agricultural stuff could never compete with. You know, like not one lab could ever compete with 5 million farmers making the best choice for their local thing. So I think, you know, it's a bit naive to think that we'll go back to those years, but I think a modest redirection into that direction would be the best way to go.
Beautiful, thank you.
So, you know, the question of scale is a big question. And I think all three of you presented beautifully on the kind of the constraints or the benefits and deficits of scaling. You know, and when we started collaborating on this series, we thought, what if we put like a farming expert together with a designer or an architect and said, we're gonna like grow really good practices in farming because there's gonna be such a demand from designers and architects and consumers of that product. Like, that would be good scaling. So, you know, and that's the that's the Pollyanna kind of big picture. Like, what if corn breeding turned into color breeding and strength of the fiber so that those pallets would all be replaced? There would be no more timber pallets. There would be only corn fiber pallets. And, you know, this color range would be in such high demand that the people in your town would just be wealthy. They would just have to like plant all of Mexico with these beautiful things. So I mean, I think the question is, you know, is how do you see that? I mean, Lane, I know you're an optimist. How do you see this? I mean, what are the challenges? Like, I mean, we hear some of the challenges, but what would be the main challenges, and where do you think this is possible? Creating new demands.
I mean, this is, for me, that's always the question, because I had to go through that, you know, like it started off as a little bit of a hippie project, you know, just being like, well, you know, let's have these one farms. I never thought about economics. You know, I'm a designer, I'm not a business guy. But I had to start thinking about economics, because in the case of this town, it's a problem that started with capitalism. So you have to find the solutions from within the system, you know. But I think it's really that way of thinking of like, okay, we produce and therefore we sell and therefore that money, you know, will provide the solutions. It's never as easy as that. And so the questions are into all of those little steps to really think about the ramifications of what could go well and what could go really badly, you know. Yeah.
But maybe just jumping off of that, you know, we've been asking, can scaling corn really contribute to these sort of circular regenerative models? Lane, when you showed we're only taking 20% of the stover, we're keeping the rest on the ground, we're alleviating all these mold, even fire, you know, aspects on fields. and we're then also producing biochar that goes to the soil health. That's one great example. Fernando, you talked about, regaining the milpa system, which again is about soil health and preventing soil erosion. But if you were to think 40 years from now, right, do these practices end up reinforcing that monoculture? Do we begin to rely more on corn? Or is there an actual way to diversify? If you were to push this model, does it end up reinforcing, this dependency on corn?
Can I jump? I mean, in our case, what we've seen is like bringing the milpa back actually created so many kind of side markets, So for example, one of the things that kind of came back to life was eating grasshoppers, which is a big thing in Mexico. And so the farmers, because the farmers were actively, again, in the fields, in this garden, because a milpa is like a garden, so in these gardens, they started to deal with the plagues the way they've always dealt with the plagues, which was instead of spraying a whole field, it was to get up really early in the morning and pick up all those grasshoppers by hand. The grasshoppers don't hop very early in the morning, and so it's easy to catch them. But all of a sudden they realized that now, it coincided with this trend in mezcal drinking, which, was really interesting because now the kind of ritual in Mexico City is like you get your mezcal and you get your little bowl of grasshoppers. And they are worth they're worth so much. A kilo of grasshoppers is like so much more expensive than anything else. And so there's another little source of revenue there. And, it goes back to perhaps, rediscovering things that have been put in pause for a while, present new opportunities. And again, sometimes it's really about culture and rituals more than metrics of efficiency,
I'll put in a word for the grasshoppers. They're really good. I think, in terms of your question of scaling, I think that what that looks like is going to be different in different situations. That's sort of been my theme for a lot of this. But overall, if you can make an acre of corn more profitable, then the pressure to just plant everything to corn goes down. I mean, I think part of the reason farmers plant more and more and more corn and soybeans is because that's what the system of agricultural subsidies supports. If they want to be profitable, the only way to do that is scale. So if you can make the individual, it's kind of the US parallel to what Fernando was talking about. If you can make the acre more profitable by having multiple products coming from it, then the pressure to plant everything to that will be less. I'm not an economist, but that's my guess.
I would agree with that, yes. The one thing about corn is, and you mentioned it earlier, is it uses a lot of nitrogen. So you almost have to rotate crops. So it's not like, there's a new application, so everybody's gonna run, go, just do corn all the time. So now you just gotta get more creative in what we do with it. And from my perspective, when you talk about scale, challenges in scale, I've got two big things that are my biggest challenges. One, how do I keep it out of the lumber distribution channel? Because that's the only way I'm gonna be effective to the end user. So if you put somebody in the middle, that's a lot of hands in that cookie jar. That doesn't sound very good, but the reality is somebody else starts setting the price. So if you're trying to build a house, do something, you're now paying the price no matter what, my price may be, somebody else is putting a margin on it. So when we look at housing, which I didn't talk much about in my presentation, but that's our final frontier. Pallets are huge, we need a big impact. But building materials, lumber's a big chunk of it. And if we're gonna be impactful, we've gotta kind of recreate a new path. And in not only design and architecture, how we use that, but at the end of the day, how do we get closer to the consumer? And that will, I think, dynamically change how corn is used or looked at based on the impact at the consumer level versus just another big corporation. And I'm not trying to dog corporations. They do a lot of great things, but they just it's just another margin for them, and it doesn't necessarily benefit the masses of us. So I hope that makes sense.
Before we maybe open it up to the crowd, just a question on the biggest potential markets. I think we've seen a really beautiful range of spectrum of where to start. Fernando, I don't know if you think luxury saves the world, but we start with something high-end. You create value, and that value can be distributed more equitably in the sort of diverse labor systems that you've, sort of evolved. Lane, you started off with the pallets, right? Mass product. And your final frontier is the building materials industry. What is ultimately that final product? We've done the skateboard as well, and we're working our way. What do you think is the market that matches, the sort of quality, the variety of corn that you're working with, corn stover that you're working with? Let's see the final visions, for you. Where do you guys see this going? And Margaret, if you also want to jump in there, if you have a building product in mind.
For us, one of our biggest differentiators, we engineer the board based on the application. So we literally could have hundreds of recipes. Cabinet needs a great screw pull test. That's different than what goes on the wall, with maybe the core of a ski, snowboard, all those things. So that is very specific, but yet we can mass produce any of those at different varieties. So that's
So
probably
flexibility.
our biggest thing. Yeah, is that we're actually making a better board more affordable.
In my case, it's very limited. The production is very limited. I was telling Lane, I got into the luxury market because our first harvest was a disaster. We had, I think after the whole season, we had a bag of corn leaves. So it was, if I was making pallets or beer coasters or something like that, it would have been gone, and I would have come back to farmers and be like, I made $50 for you all, So I went as expensive as we could go with the very limited material that we had at the very beginning. The corn is just one of the projects that we're doing. I also work with agaves, and agaves we're using for the erosion problem, so that's another thing. And in a way, like every time that I come up with a new idea, it's thinking about my client, which I would argue it's not the collector, but it's the families that I work with, So it's almost like I've designed a whole system to provide a solution or a market for them rather than the collector at the end. It all has to do with scale, like I said. So I think for me that has been another way of measuring sustainability as well, because it's to say, okay, if I look at the end of my career and I look back and I look what I left behind, it'll probably be maybe just a couple of hundred pieces, at the end of my career, which in terms of productivity, it's nothing. But at the end of the day, it's about this. It's about being creative to find create almost like a new market that didn't exist, and play this game of making money and sharing that money the most ethical way with the people that I work with. That's kind of my goal. So I don't think too much about big scale. Yeah.
So I'm a corn breeder, not a product designer in the same sense. But one thing that occurs to me is that the big picture, the end game, is just as the farmers, this beautiful example of the farmer who did his own breeding to come up with a different husk color, farmers will do that. They're incredibly creative, and they've selected, they're the ones who did all that breeding, really. Plant breeders, with our understanding of genetics, have kind of put a little icing on that cake, but the cake is from all the many indigenous farmers who've done all their selection over years. I think from the US side more, it would be really interesting if there were enough of a draw that somebody, either the big seed companies or somebody else, actually bred corn with the stover side in mind, not just the grain side. Because right now it's all focused on, I talk to my friends and colleagues in the big seed industry, and you ask them, what are the 10 most important traits for a corn hybrid in the US? And those are yield, 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 and standability. It has to stand up. So, could we get past that to something that focused not just on how much grain per acre, but how much utility of the biomass produced per acre in a way that is also sustainable and maintains the soil health. So I think those are things breeders, we have our own design process. We have all that tremendous array of genetic diversity that's present in corn. It's unbelievable, right? So can we use that to help design an agricultural system that's less grain-centric?
Beautiful, thank you. All right, so we're going to open it up to our fantastic crowd. I don't know if there are questions in the audience. All right, we're going to kick it off with the first one here.
Hi. Thank you all for your presentations. They were really informative and just inspiring. I will kind of give a little intro of myself because I'm trying to do better about that. I came from Baltimore on the train, so it was a journey, but also a pleasure to know that I was going to come hear you all speak. I lived in Mexico, in Teotitlan, 20 years ago. And so I had this relationship with weavers and spent time learning. And now I have a space in Baltimore that 6 years on, we have a dye garden fiber space. We have a workshop and production space where we build and sort of cultivate things. Corn is one of those things. Indigo is the biggest one because everybody loves indigo. So I guess I would ask to Fernando really the relationship to the community that you began as a child, but then professionally as you grew up. Where did you find yourself in the sort of cross of committing to these people and as a cultural sort of institution, and the sort of space of productivity, commodity, what called you to feel or to find yourself in a space of being an advocate and not just a designer who drops in and has somebody weave a thing and leaves and is about sort of a luxury bend, I guess would be my question. Yeah.
I mean, I think the personal connection is really what drives most of it, because it's also not as easy to just arrive to a community and be like, work with me, so there was already a trust from our kind of decades of knowing each other. But at the end of the day, I think my role is not only about making this new material, it's also kind of giving them a bit of a microphone and a podium, So I've become a little bit of a translator of two worlds that are usually not speaking to each other. And I think the best example of how that has been working is a few years ago I got invited to the World Economic Forum, which is kind of like the playground for capitalists, And so it was really interesting to be included in a conference like that. And this was in, anyways. What was interesting was that they offered me to take two collaborators with me, and instead of picking someone from my studio in Mexico City, we brought Delfino and we brought Nicolas, another one of the farmers, and I kind of took a step back and they gave the talk, because the conference has everything, the translators and all the facilities to give them the best chances of speaking directly to the crowd. So that was great, I think at the end of the day, that's what the project is about as well. It's not only about making materials, it's also about communicating these ideas that are sometimes very hard to talk about, or, for them to really speak directly. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I've tried to do, It's, and that's why I always say yes to these kind of opportunities to speak to the public, because they're ideas that are very hard to communicate on an Instagram post or through the website. So you need time to really talk about the backstory. Yeah.
Thank you. This was really phenomenal and so interesting and inspiring, and also the kind of combination of different knowledge and experiences was, I think, critically needed. And I have a question for you about scale. And Fernando, you talked about scale and kind of the microcosm of scaling up while working with a community, looks at the community as a client and how scaling up can help kind of cultivate that relationship. But perhaps, Lane, can you add further about scaling your perception? Because the way I sometimes perceive corn is the nemesis of scale, or you didn't mention the word genetically modification, right? The GMO-ness that is so associated with corn, and then what does it mean to produce a building material from a co-product of a grain that has been associated so vastly with kind of the wrong agricultural practices, is maybe my question for you. So can scale be envisioned for a panel like the CornBoard in ways that is originally created or supports regenerative agricultural practices? Is there a recipe that can be, or a system or a model that can be shared with local farmers who can then produce this in their own kind of original setting? What are your thoughts?
That could be a real big rabbit trail, but the GMO affects us least because we're taking a byproduct that you're not eating, or it's not, so we're just taking quantity and putting it into a board structural that doesn't have that impact. So that's kind of where I think that is in terms of scale for us, is just taking that extra biomass. Not necessarily solving all the issues related to GMO, non-GMO. We are working with a couple farmers in Nebraska that sell organic corn to Frito-Lay, and we take their stover out of their field because it's organic, and we make, flat pallets for Frito-Lay. So, we think that's cool, we're supporting that versus GMO corn. Some of that might be GMO, but it's organic. So we're making an impact there. And, one of the comments about what Fernando's doing, look at the voice he has. They never invited me anywhere. So even small quantity is a huge voice for us. So he's more important almost on the front end than what scale can be. Scale is maybe the masses, but how do we get there? And part of my talk was about how do you put products that influence people. But again, he's the Louis Vuitton of what we're doing. You don't need to sell that much. Just raise the price. So his voice is huge, and the impact of what he's doing is I think resonating as we're all collectively really trying to solve some problems that exist. And so I think we're not necessarily the ones that are creating the problems that exist. Agriculture is a can of worms, and we can really go down some serious rabbit holes of the problems that exist there. But if we can start doing some positives, I look at it as a domino effect. We can make one positive domino that falls, and that impacts another domino. All of a sudden we create this momentum, and that's really kind of what we're doing, and so that's...
if I can add something a little bit about scale, I think the hardest thing to imagine is scaling down, That's a real challenge. It's not about scaling. It's about, liberating our minds from eternal growth. For me, that's the challenge.
One, two, three.
Thank you. It's a great talk. Thanks for organizing it. Really interesting. I grew up in the Midwest, so this is striking a nostalgic nerve. Question again for Lane. I teach in the product design program. We try and get all of our students to design so that the products ideally would either go into a technical cycle or a biological cycle. How close are you to developing a biodegradable adhesive so that the material that you bind together could go back into the soil? If you can share I know this is probably something that you mentioned you couldn't talk a lot about, but whatever you could share, that seems to be really the holy grail for these types of agricultural-based materials.
Yes, biodegradable is huge, because we want to make like pet coffins, you know. Literally, I mean, if we want them to we want to biodegrade. So we've been working with some stuff, and mainly with straw. When you get straw at a certain temperature, it creates a glue. It's about 320 degrees, and so that's about all I can share there. But we're looking, and you know, we're over here trying to make products and money, but the same token is how do we get where we can do that? But biodegradable is definitely on our radar in certain products that we can put it where it goes back. It ends up in a landfill. I mean, that's the biggest thing. Pallets in a landfill. That's why we want to lease them versus sell them, so they come back to us and we can grind them back up and make board, or you know, cut them and use what's available. So that's a big thing. Great question. And there's just not really a lot of binders out there. There's some soy-based stuff that might fit in that category of biodegradable.
Yeah, there was a great company we used to work with called E2E Materials out of Cornell in Ithaca. But they got acquired by Godavari, which is the largest sugar company, Indian sugar company. They produce a lot of ethanol. So we're actually seeing, you know, a lot of these really promising bioadhesives now being taken over by, you know, global majority corporations. You know, they're thinking ahead. But it's so interesting, the binderless, you know, sort of pathway where you make use of that melting in all of these natural materials is the best way, right? But then you're dealing with so much variability in composition. And so soy is fantastic because it comes out of the soy industry, another monoculture. Even like learning from all the big four, it's like so polite, will grow anywhere. It's taking over animal products, and the byproduct of that for the binders is fantastic. But you also have to think, what are we also bringing along when we increase the demand for that? You know, because soy binds to so many agricultural substrates super efficiently. So that opens another sort of can of worms. And yeah, they're all interconnected. Yeah. I think there was 1, 2, and then back to you. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for a fascinating panel. I have 2 questions, and one is very kind of self-centered, I guess, because I'm working with farmers in the Hudson Valley to grow sorghum, which you all know is a kind of sister plant to corn, and they look very, very similar. And we're also testing the soil and finding amazing kind of carbon contributions to the soil and regenerative aspects. Not, you know, doesn't need to be irrigated. It doesn't need as much nitrogen as corn. So I'm a little biased, but I think there are like reasons to grow sorghum over corn. And I'm curious what's going on in the sorghum biomaterial world, if anyone knows. But I'm also curious about, there's this question about the monoculture, and I loved what Margaret said about, you know, kind of what's happening in the farming world in New York State, and there's not as much corn being grown, there's very, very little sorghum being grown, but there's a big diversity of different crops. And I think that begs the question of, like, are people thinking about not only growing milpas and diverse, you know, intercropping and so forth, but why not diverse bio boards, right? Are there mixing of these materials to think about breaking that chain of the monocrop, and then kind of putting more kind of demand for different crops that maybe are not super profitable to kind of boost diversity in what farmers are growing?
I signed an NDA to only talk about corn, so I can't address that. No, I'm just kidding. We pressed probably over 30 different biomasses, and sorghum is one of them. And it is a fantastic compromise. I wouldn't say compromise, it's a complement to corn stover. They can be intermixed. We press board both of them together. And on the fringe of the corn belt is sorghum. And so it's a fantastic product. There's so many different biomasses. Corn stover is our easiest to get out of the field with the least impact. Sorghum's not too bad, but it's not as concentrated.
I would just say that, it kind of all goes back to what enables the people growing those crops to actually make a viable living. And whether that's selling high-end products from them or whether that's making use of all of the residues, the more the economics of the situation supports those kind of diverse crops, people will do them. They'll respond to that. They respond to when there's a market for their traditional corn. When that market disappears, they have to do something else. So I think that, as we think about diversity, it's one of the things we have more of here in New York. We could probably use more of it. But as you think about other parts, like the big central part of the country, more diversity will come from farmers being able to make money off of a greater array of crops. And that's really what it boils down to. I'm still trying, by the way, to pack my brain back in. It kind of blew up my head to think about breeding corn for pet coffins.
Literally, that's my retirement plan, Lane. Just a quick thing on the biodiversity. We have a research area called Soil Sisters at EALC, and the idea is really to promote biodiversity. And so maybe two areas of products. One is the myco-composites, because mycelium eats a whole range of substrates, and it's super interesting to think about how you can mix and match. Something that has more lignin, stronger versus cellulose, will be great for the mycelium. And all of a sudden you have a seasonal inventory, a mix of crops that can participate in delivering a relatively standardized, low-density product, like insulation. And the other, and maybe this speaks to Fernando's work, is really this world of plant-based color that comes out of the roots, the stalks, the stems of different plants. And all of a sudden, we call them plantones. I love saying this. But these plant tone catalogs are very much place-based. And they come off, the agricultural value chain. After you use, many of these materials, if you boil them, that's when you can extract the color. So it's not in competition. It's something that happens after, but really depends on, what kind of color you're looking for. But just to plug it in there, maybe they're not actually, sort of higher density products. There might be other opportunities, like the binders with soy or color, base.
If I can add a thought to that. So I spoke about corn because that's the topic of today, but an equally strong project of mine is planting agaves for reforestation of these lands that you saw totally eroded. So we've been planting agaves for 10 years in a very strategic way to sort of become barriers for the water as it goes down the hills in the summer. And they are what we call pioneering plants. So you plant the agaves first, and they create the right situations for other plants to come back. But what we saw was that after 5 or 6 years of planting them, we were planting a couple of thousand of agaves at a time, But, after 5, 6 years, that's 50, 60,000 agaves. That's a lot of plants. And they all started to flower at the same time, which is not natural, So this is a great example of like how the human hand can actually be beneficial for kickstarting processes that would normally take a lot longer. And what we saw as an unintended positive result of that is that the main pollinators of the agave started to arrive en masse, and these are bats. They pollinate the flowers at night. And then as a further unintended consequence, they omnivores. So they started to then fly down the hills into the lower lands where we plant the corn, and they started to pick up every single insect that was plaguing the corn, So from one year to the next, basically everyone in the town stopped using any form of pesticides, So this is, I think, a very clear example of how agriculture can also be measured in not only economic wealth, but in ecological wealth, in a wealth of biodiversity. So sometimes, again, this is another way of measuring the success of a project, is to really see how much more you create beyond just what could be commercialized.
We have one last question.
Sorry, don't want to be an asshole. No, we've spoken about like insects and stuff, but if corn is really, gonna scale up in the future, what's the word with like blight? How are you guys fixing it? And can blighted corn still be used as like structural material or whatever? As in, how will the diseased corn affect this, like the design aspect of it or the fabrication aspect of it?
So when we see something that's a little off, we can blend it. So we can deal with when we see like a little mold or something, as long as it's not significant. But these different things, you mix it in slowly. And so therefore we don't waste it and it's not extensive. But some things, if they're bad, you just can't put it in there and then we just turn it to biochar.
But what if can you not like use an entire batch of like diseased corn to make something specific?
It's so inexpensive that it's just easier the complication of a binder and all those kind of things, it's better just to turn it to biochar. And then we take that and now we're giving the farmer something perfect to put back on their field. It's a way to eradicate things without, carrying it on. But we can mix things in.
But also, I think this is part of being a farmer, It's constantly dealing with loss and bad harvests and, bad weather. I think, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should be obsessed about constantly turning things into other things. Like, it's perfectly fine to have a bad season for most farmers.
I'll just add one more comment, which is that the more diverse the set of crops on a given landscape, the less likely you are to have those big disease problems because the thing right next to you is not also part of your buffet. So the pathogens spread less if you have a more diverse agricultural system.
Okay, we're gonna do just one more because this looks urgent. Back there.
Thank you. I have a background in biomaterials and testing and performance, so I'm very grateful to have this question. Lane, Fernando, Margaret, thank you so much sharing your life's work. It's amazing to see just the multidisciplinary reach that this can have. And I really feel like Margaret here is the key. I see future collaborations with plant breeding with different dyes or tensile strength in the stalks. So it's amazing. Because I have an interest in materials and bio-based materials, my question is directed towards Lane. I'm curious about the life cycle analysis of the pallets and how they compare to traditionally used pallets. And I know that you mentioned that you use biochar and more commercial binders, but all of those have kind of their own footprints in this lifespan. So curious of how currently with the pallets it compares to traditional lumber, treated or untreated, and also for the future, how you project into building construction materials.
Okay, that's a big question. But so we do lease pallets instead of purchase pallets. So we're not selling them because ours outlast. And we designed, I think we got 6 patents on designs for pallets. So as long as they've been around, we've made them more structural. So we can use robotics to take them apart, fix them, keep them in the marketplace. So if you look at the warehouse space, it's kind of the low-hanging fruit. There's probably 100, 150 million pallets in that area, and they're mainly purchasing low-grade pallets, and they're spending a lot of money. Cheap is not so cheap. They're blowing through them. We did a test at Ralph Lauren at their distribution center. Our pallet was outlasting 10x. So that means for every pallet that we put in there, they had to buy 10. So that's the biggest switch, is how do we get them out of these pallets that are just blowing through and end up in landfill? How do we put them in a cradle-to-cradle program where we're keeping them in there? So that's the biggest thing for the pallet. And then obviously, what was the question on the building materials?
Just like I don't want to use the word replacement because these products will be like alternatives, but essentially where do you see the performance of these building materials with OSB, plywood, the replacement, the performance?
So OSB is a low-grade board. We outperform it on almost every characteristic, and we're really not trying to compete, because if we did, we'd have to make a lower grade board. We're really competing with plywood. Frito-Lay has about 1 million flatboards. They move their chips internally around their system, and they use plywood, and we're between 2 and 3x. Theirs last about 12 to 14 months. Ours are lasting 2 or 3 years. So it's really, we're engineering a board to outperform, and we feel the same way about building materials when we get to it. And back to your question on the certifications, we're exempt from the international code for pallets going overseas because ours don't have bugs in them. And because it's not a wood, but we actually press at a temperature where if there was anything in it, it's done. So that's another positive thing. No chemicals or anything when you mentioned the treated. And we have a Class A fire rating. And we're not using anything bad there. I can't talk about that.
I mean, I want to say how it's amazing what you're producing, and it's so exciting. And I want to remind everybody that like the appropriate use of materials that have a high binder content is a material like a product like a pallet, because the exposure to humans, the like proximity to humans in an everyday life over hours of our life is very little. They live a lot in warehouses. Because we don't yet know what the binder is, and I understand that's proprietary, and it's great to hear that high heat is a part of the process because that may mean that there's less other stuff. We would be very cautious until we know what is in that binder before we put it in any building material. Because even though you have this Class A fire retardant, we'd like to know what that is. And we'd like to know what is in that binder, because if we think about timber, it's a singular material. Its structure is based on its cellulose and the structure of a tree. That's one material. If we start thinking about composite materials, that we're talking about lots of ingredients. And then like a Frito-Lay, we need to know what's in that Frito chip before we put it in our body. We would want to know what's in that building product. So I just want to bring that to the fore, because it's not just, biomaterials are great, but we need to look at all of those ingredients that go into a material and their proximity to our life. Thank you all for coming. It's been a fantastic audience.